She thought it was just another slow shift until she quietly covered the tab for a hungry young man who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. What she didn't expect was to arrive at work the next morning to find 400 uniformed soldiers standing outside the diner, waiting for her. What had she unknowingly stepped into? Stay tuned to uncover the heart behind their unexpected return. Rain kept pounding on the diner window, little streams running down the glass like tears. Inside, the warmth from the coffee machine didn't ease the exhaustion weighing heavy on Eliza's shoulders. Late shifts always left her wiped out, but she hid her tiredness with a smile, pouring drinks and wiping the counter gently and calmly. It was nearly midnight when the door creaked open. A cold gust blew in, making a few folks turn their heads. A young man stepped in, soaked through, his jacket torn at the sleeve and his boots caked with dried mud. He moved slowly, not from age but caution, like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. Eliza looked up from the cash register and met his eyes. They were surprisingly clear, hidden under his messy hair and wet lashes. He stepped up to the counter, his hands shaking a little. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said softly, just a bit louder than the rain. "I just need a meal. I don't have any money. But if you could give me a sandwich, anything warm, I'd wash dishes, mop the floor, whatever you need." Eliza hesitated. He was young, probably her age, maybe younger, but the lines on his face told a story much older than his years. His voice wasn't begging or seeking pity, just a quiet seriousness laced with desperation. She glanced toward the kitchen, then at the tray holding a full plate of meatballs and mashed potatoes, a canceled order still hot. Without another word, she pulled the tray from the warmer, added a cup of black coffee, and gently set it in front of him. "Someone canceled their order," she said. "It'd be a waste to throw it out." The man blinked. "Thank you. I mean it." She smiled and turned to grab some napkins. That moment shattered when a sharp voice cut in. "Just eat it." But that moment shattered when a sharp voice cut through the quiet. Eliza's manager, Greg, stepped out from the back with a stern look on his face. "What's this?" She calmly replied, "It's a return meal. He's hungry. I don't care if the Pope is hungry. We don't give away food." Eliza stood her ground. "It'd be wasted." "Not your call," Greg snapped. "You're not running a charity here. The young man had set his fork down, and you want to feed the whole street. Do it on your own dime." Eliza looked at the young man, who had set his fork down and started to stand. "I'll go," he mumbled. "No," she said quickly, turning to Greg. "Take it out of my tips." Greg curled his lip. "You're fired." Silence fell like a dropped glass. The diner froze. Eliza slowly untied her apron, set it on the counter, and nodded. No anger, no tears, just weary acceptance. She stepped out into the rain, the door slamming behind her. The cold hit her like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She walked down the street, her thin coat against the wind, the weight of her decision heavier than her soaked shoes. Behind her, footsteps splashed through puddles. She turned around. The young man had followed her, his coat pulled tight, his eyes fixed on her. "I'll never forget what you did back there," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold and something else. "You didn't treat me like trash. You saw me." Eliza looked at him, really looked. The storm had left dark circles under his eyes, but something in him wasn't broken. She smiled softly, pressing a hand to her chest to hold on to that warmth. "Everyone deserves to be seen," she whispered. Then, without another word, she turned and walked into the night, unaware that this moment, this choice, would echo farther than she could imagine. The room above the laundromat smelled faintly of soap and mildew. Eliza shut the door behind her with a tired sigh, letting her wet coat slide off her shoulders onto the lone chair by the wall. The heater groaned as she turned the knob, more noise than warmth. Smoky. Her orange tabby cat she'd rescued meowed from his spot on the windowsill, lazily stretching before curling up again. She sat on the edge of the bed, her toes numb from the cold, her fingers clutching on to the last bit of her dignity. Getting fired just like that. For giving a stranger a meal someone else had left, her tips from the week. The little she had were already gone on cat food and half a bag of groceries. Rent was due in 4 days, and she was already late on the electric bill. She stared up at the ceiling, blinking back tears that refused to fall. The next morning, A knock at the door startled her. Not a loud knock, just two soft taps. When she opened it, no one was in the hallway. Just a plain white envelope lying at her feet. She carefully picked it up and stepped inside. The envelope wasn't sealed. Inside was cash, enough to cover next month's rent. She gasped, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the note tucked inside. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. People like you deserve more than just survival. No name, no signature, just those words and their quiet weight. Eliza clutched the note to her chest, her mind racing. Who? Why? She thought back to the man from the diner, his clear eyes, the way he looked at her like she was the first to truly see him in a long time. That weekend, while walking home from a nearby grocery store, Eliza stopped at the corner by the church. A small crowd had gathered in the alley beside it. Volunteers were setting up fold-out tables with warm food, clean socks, and first aid kits. She drew closer, pulled in by the smell of toasted bread and the soft laughter of folks with little to laugh about. And then she saw him. Those same eyes, that same build, but now clean-shaven, in a dark wool coat and gloves. He stood behind a table, handing out wrapped sandwiches and coffee thermoses. His smile was quiet but genuine, coming from somewhere deep. She stood frozen for a moment before stepping forward. "Hey," she said, unsure if he remembered. He looked up and smiled like he'd been waiting for her. "Eliza." She blinked. "How are you?" he asked, glancing around. He said simply, "Reaching under the table." He pulled out a wrapped sandwich and handed it to her. She hesitated. "It's turkey," he said, "with cranberry sauce. I remembered you mentioned it was your favorite when you served me." She slowly took it, her fingers brushing his. "Warm. You didn't have to do this." He shook his head. "You gave me my first real meal in days. This is my first time sharing one." There was a pause between them. Not awkward, just gentle. "You look different," she said. He chuckled. "A shower and a shave will do that." She studied him. There was something steady in the way he stood, something that didn't quite fit the story of a man down on his luck. But before she could ask more, a woman behind him called his name. "Aiden." He turned, waved lightly in greeting, then looked back at Eliza. "Come back tomorrow. I want to talk more." And with that, he returned to his table, handing out coffee to a couple of veterans who patted him on the back. Eliza walked home that night with the sandwich still warm in her hand and something warmer curling in her chest. She still didn't know who Aiden really was, but somehow she knew her story with him wasn't over. Winter deepened in the small town of Millage, frosting the windows and weaving chill into morning breaths. Morning breaths. However, amid the cold, Eliza found warmth, not in electricity or blankets, but in the quiet presence of a man who never left her thoughts. Aiden had become a constant in her struggling days. At the community soup kitchen, she often saw him there before her, tying on an apron, rolling up his sleeves, greeting elders with a kind nod and kids with warm jokes. At the free clinic where Eliza volunteered part-time, scheduling appointments, Aiden would drop by, delivering supplies or guiding patients across the muddy street without any fuss. "You're volunteering everywhere," she teased once, handing him a box of donated scarves to distribute. "I like warm things," he replied with a shrug. People, soup, scarves, smiles. But whenever she asked about him, his job, where he lived, why he was in town, he'd dodge with a half smile and change the subject. He once said some stories need time to tell, his eyes on the snow-covered roofs, and some are better when you're ready to listen. She should have minded the mystery, but she didn't. Not when his actions spoke louder than most confessions. One morning, as Eliza stepped out of her apartment, she found a single daisy placed carefully on her doormat, a little wilted against the gray concrete. Tied around the stem was a small brown ribbon and a scribbled note on the back of a bakery receipt. Just because the world is gray doesn't mean you have to be. It was the first time in weeks she truly laughed. Not a tired sigh, not a forced smile, a real laugh that even startled Smokey, who blinked at her from the windowsill. She tucked the daisy into a glass jar and set it on her nightstand. It stayed there long after the petals started curling. Their rhythm became something sacred, a nod from across the food line. A cup of hot cocoa passed without a word at the bus stop. A shared silence on the church steps after closing. But one Friday, the cold bit deeper than usual. Eliza woke up with a sore throat and a fever burning behind her eyes. She wrapped herself in layers, but still felt like ice had settled into her bones. Work called, insisting she rest and stay home. Her neighbor, an older woman named Marge, brought over a bottle of ginger tea. But by nightfall, Eliza couldn't keep anything down. She curled up under 3 blankets. Smokey nestled at her side, shivering even as the heater hummed at her feet. The world felt distant, her breaths shallow, her head pounding. A soft knock woke her. She weakly made her way to the door. No one was there, but on the ground was a small thermos steaming inside a cloth-wrapped basket. Next to it was a folded note, with trembling fingers. She opened it. "I know this town gets cold, especially when your body is fighting to stay warm. Tonight, let me return a little of what you gave me. This is chicken soup, my mom's recipe. Eat slowly. Feel loved." It was signed with just a letter A. The soup was rich and golden, with uneven carrot chunks and noodles that stuck to the spoon like they were afraid to be left behind. Each sip warmed her stomach. It heated the deep place in her chest that had been quiet for too long. That night, she didn't see Aiden, but she didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, they didn't talk about feelings or plans, but something was building, subtle and intentional, a trust unspoken, but built on shared kindness and wordless glances. And though she still didn't know who he really was, Eliza wasn't afraid of the mystery anymore, because whatever his story, it had led him to her door. And somehow that made all the difference. A knock thundered at the door just after sunrise. Eliza opened it with a hesitant hand, still in her faded diner uniform from the night before. She'd fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted and worn from too much work and too little rest. But what she saw on the other side jolted her awake. 2 soldiers stood at attention in crisp uniforms, hats tucked under one arm, their faces stern and silent. Behind them was a line of black military vehicles, engines rumbling, forming an arc around her narrow street. Eliza Hart, the taller one, asked. She nodded slowly, her breath catching in her throat. "You've been requested for immediate transport to Fort Alder. I think you have the wrong person," she stammered. "We don't do that." The soldier's voice was firm but respectful. "There's a ceremony. You're the guest of honor." Neighbors peeked through curtains, stepped onto porches, and whispered. A kid dropped his bike. A woman clutched her chest. No one understood what was happening, not even Eliza. The soldiers opened the back door of the lead vehicle. "We're under orders to escort you with full honors." Eliza didn't know what to say. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She climbed in. As the convoy pulled away, sirens silent, the tension in the air was deafening. A procession of black SUVs and military trucks rolled through town like a quiet parade. Traffic parted for them. Cops blocked intersections. People stood on sidewalks, pointing, filming, and guessing. Inside the car, Eliza sat still as a statue. Her palms were sweaty, her heart pounding. This had to be a mistake. After nearly an hour, they reached Fort Alder, tall fences, watchtowers, a massive flag waving against the pale morning sky. The gates opened for them, and there, right beyond the checkpoint, was a sight that took Eliza's breath away. 300 soldiers standing in perfect formation, shoulder to shoulder, stretching across the parade ground in rows. The entire square in front of the base had been cleared for this moment. Their uniforms were spotless, boots polished, medals gleaming in the sunlight, and not a single one moved or spoke. As Eliza stepped out of the car, silence enveloped everything. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Her shoes crunched on the gravel. She was led forward, shaking, down a path lined with the honor guard. They saluted in unison, sharp, respectful, and precise. At the end of the path, on a small platform draped with flags, stood a man she barely recognized, but her heart did. Medals, hat tucked under his arm. It was Aiden, in full dress uniform, medals on his chest, hat tucked under his arm, his posture proud, his face no longer hungry or tired, but bright, with quiet strength. She stopped midway Aiden. Her voice was just a whisper. "What's this?" He stepped forward, his voice steady but strong. "My name is Major Aiden Black. I serve in a special operations unit with the UCS, Army's Humanitarian Forces. For the past few months, I've been undercover, searching and observing." She shook her head, stunned. "You were lying. I wasn't lying. I just didn't tell you who I was because I needed to see something the world forgets." He glanced at the rows of soldiers. "I needed to check if kindness still exists without recognition, if compassion can survive without attention. And then I met you." Eliza held her breath. Aiden stepped closer. "You gave me food. But more than that, you gave me dignity. You looked at me like I was still somebody." She swallowed, her eyes stinging. "Why are they here?" Aiden turned to the soldiers, then back to her. "Because what you did matters more than you think. Today, we're bringing 300 soldiers here, not to intimidate or question, but to honor. To show you what happens when one right act can shake the whole system." Eliza's hands trembled. She whispered, "I'm just a waitress." Aiden smiled, his eyes gentle. "No, you're the reason hope is still real." And in that moment, before the silence broke, Eliza realized she hadn't been summoned. She had been welcomed. The warm smell of cornbread filled the small hallway of the new community center. The paint was still fresh on the walls, and sunlight streamed through windows that hadn't seen light in years. She stood at the center of it all, apron tied, sleeves rolled up, and a quiet fire in her chest. But here she was, running the center, backed by a military initiative. Its kitchen was open to hungry kids, tired veterans, single moms, and anyone the world tried to overlook. She hadn't asked for this, but she grew into it like roots clinging to old soil. The oven timer dinged. Eliza pulled out a tray of roasted veggies, the aroma rich and comforting. Laughter echoed from the next room, where a group of kids folded paper cranes with the ease only children have. Beside them, Aiden knelt down. The laughter echoes from the next room, where a group of kids are folding paper cranes with the easygoing charm that only children have. Admittedly. Instead, he comes early to next to them. Aiden is bending down. He has never once asked for recognition. Instead, he shows up early every Saturday morning with a bunch of wildflowers, chrysanthemums, yellow chrysanthemums, sometimes a white lily, and leaves them by the sink in the kitchen with a note that says, "For the keeper of the flame." He fixed squeaky hinges without being asked, repaired leaky faucets, and taught the kids how to fold napkins into animal shapes for their lunch trays. There were days he just sat with the elders, listening more than speaking, just listening. Eliza often watched him, always from a quiet distance. It would have been easier if he were still that man from the diner, mysterious and fleeting, like a kind moment she could cherish and let go. But Aiden stayed, and every gentle act, every moment he gave without expecting anything back, slowly pulled at the walls she'd built to protect a heart that had been broken too many times, especially by the last guy who said he loved her and then vanished when rent was due and life demanded more than charm. One Thursday afternoon, the center was buzzing, kids running around, volunteers handing out books and sandwiches. Eliza was slicing apples when she heard a soft voice. Miss Eliza, she turned. A little girl, about 6 or 7, stood holding a folded paper crane. Her braids were loose, and there was glue on her chin. "Yes, sweetie." The girl looked serious. "Is Aiden your husband?" Eliza blinked. "No, he's not." "Oh." The child paused. "Is he your boyfriend?" Eliza smiled gently. "No, honey." The girl frowned, clearly confused. "Then who is he?" There was a pause long enough for Eliza to feel her throat tighten. She glanced around the room. Aiden was kneeling by another child, showing him how to twist pipe cleaners into a star. His eyes met hers. He smiled, not the kind you give to everyone, but the kind you save for someone who's seen your worst. Eliza looked back at the girl, kneeling beside her. She tucked the girl's loose braid behind her ear and said softly, "He's the one who makes me want to believe again." The child tilted her head, believing what Eliza's voice was a little hoarse, that not everyone leaves. That night, after washing the last dish and the kids had gone home, Eliza found the usual wildflowers by the sink. But this time, instead of one note, there were 2. The first note was as usual, "For the one who keeps the flame." The second one simply said, "I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere." The first chill of autumn crept into the community kitchen. Eliza stood alone that evening, apron untied, late sunlight pouring through the windows like honey. The laughter had faded, chairs were stacked, and a warm quiet settled over the space she'd come to call her own. On the prep table was something she wasn't expecting, a small, rusty tin box, its metal edges slightly worn. On top, a folded note in handwriting she now knew by heart, "For the one who gave me back my breath." Eliza opened the lid with careful fingers. Inside was a simple silver chain with a small spoon pendant. On the back of it, etched in faint but steady lines, were the words, "For the girl who fed my hope." She caught her breath. It wasn't flashy jewelry. It was something quieter, heavier, a piece of truth. Behind her, footsteps approached, steady and light. She turned. Aiden stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, his coat dusted with leaves from the wind outside. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then he stepped closer, his voice low. "That spoon," he said, nodding toward the necklace, "was my mom's. My mom, She used to say, 'A meal prepared.' She used to say, 'A meal prepared with care can heal more than medicine.' After my last deployment, I stopped believing in that. I stopped believing in most things." He looked at her now, eyes unguarded. "I came back, but not really. I was angry at the silence, at the world, at myself. Stopped, so they gave me another." He stopped, so they gave me another mission, sent me to places we'd forgotten, let me search for people who still believed in something good, people who give even when the world takes. Eliza's fingers closed around the pendant, and then he added, stepping close enough for her to smell the faint cinnamon from the afternoon cookies still on his coat. "I met a waitress who offered me a meal without asking who I'd been. Someone who didn't flinch when the world said no to her, who stood taller when things got tough and gave like she had nothing to lose, even when it cost her everything." He reached out and took her hand, warm, gentle, steady. "You brought me back," he said, "not to the army, not to a title, but to myself. You reminded me what hope tastes like. It tastes like cornbread and chicken stew and a quiet place where someone says your name like it matters." Eliza said nothing. She couldn't. Her throat choked with unshed tears, and her heart, battered from too many yesterdays, now beat with something dangerously like faith. So, instead of words, she turned to the stove. From the oven, she pulled out a small dish. Nothing fancy, just roasted veggies, warm rolls, and a pot of lentil soup still steaming beside it. She set the table in silence. 2 bowls, 2 spoons. Aiden sat down. He didn't ask any questions. They ate slowly, like people who know what hunger means, not just for food, but for understanding, for safety, for someone who sees you and stays. When the last bite was gone and the tea had cooled in their cups, Aiden reached across the table and placed his hand on hers again. "Thank you," he said softly, "for seeing me before I remembered who I was." Eliza finally looked up, her eyes shining. "You've made it easier," she whispered. "You showed up." A knock sounded at the door right after sunrise. Eliza, already in the kitchen stirring oatmeal for breakfast, wiped her hands and opened it with sleepy eyes and flour on her cheek. A young officer stood at attention, uniform impeccable, voice formal but kind. "Miss Eliza James, we're pleased to request your presence outside." Immediately, she blinked, confused. "Outside? Why? Please. You'll understand when you see." Eliza stepped out in her old sneakers and apron, still dusted with flour, but as soon as her feet hit the sidewalk, she stopped. The main street, usually quiet in the early morning, was no longer just a road. It had become an honor corridor. Lined up on both sides, shoulder to shoulder in perfect formation, were soldiers. Hundreds of them, their uniforms gleaming in the dawn light, boots polished, faces solemn, at least 300 strong. Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, men and women of all ages and backgrounds, standing as one, saluting silently. The town around them was still, as if the world itself had paused to witness. Shopkeepers peered through windows. Early joggers stopped in their tracks. Cars pulled over. Engines went quiet. A kid on a bike halted and stared. Eliza felt the breath leave her lungs. Her name whispered through the air, passed from soldier to soldier like a prayer. Eliza, she's here. The two officers stepped forward and gently guided her down the street. As she walked, each soldier raised a hand in salute, not for a president, not for a general, but for a waitress, for a woman who offered a hot meal to a man the world tried to forget. And at the end of the street, under an arch of white flags, was a small stage. On it stood a tall man in a decorated blue uniform, Aiden, but not the Aiden she'd first met in a ragged coat and quiet humility. This was Major Aiden Black, his chest full of honors, his demeanor proud. But when he looked at her, he wasn't a soldier. He was a man in love. Eliza stepped up, a little shaky. The air thickened with silence. She could hardly hear her own breathing. Aiden took the microphone, then paused. For a long moment, he said nothing. And then, there are many kinds of service. His voice was deep, even, but raw. Some carry weapons, some carry hope, some give orders, others give second chances. He turned fully to face her. Eliza James gave me both. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She didn't know I was a soldier. She didn't care. She fed me when I was forgotten. She saw me not as a burden, but as a man. And through that kindness, she brought me back to myself. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, velvet box. Then, he knelt right there in front of the soldiers, in front of the town, in front of the woman who changed everything. Eliza James, he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. Will you marry me? The man you fed, the soul you saved, the soldier you reminded, the meaning of being human. Her hands flew to her mouth, her knees nearly buckled, but she sank down beside him, eyes wet, voice strong. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Aiden, 1,000 times yes. The crowd erupted. Applause thundered. The soldiers lowered their salutes and cheered. Flags waved. Bells rang. The quiet town of Maplewood echoed with joy it hadn't known in years. And amid it all, a waitress and a soldier stood there. No longer strangers. No longer broken. Just two people who found each other through one quiet act of kindness. The wedding took place right in the community center they helped build, inside the humble kitchen of the Maplewood Veterans and Family Center. No chandeliers, no string quartets, no champagne towers, just the warm scent of simmering chicken soup, fresh baked bread cooling by the window, and dozens of vases of wildflowers arranged by volunteers who insisted that love deserves beauty no matter the budget. Eliza wore a simple white dress borrowed from the center's donation closet and lovingly altered by 3 retired nurses who once sewed uniforms. Her hair was pinned with baby's breath, and her only jewelry was a necklace she'd found in her mother's things years ago. Inside was a photo of her as a child held by a man in uniform. She didn't know his name, but today she felt seen. The crowd was small, but sincere neighbors. Veterans, the kids she'd read to on Tuesday lunches, the women she'd cooked beside, and, of course, the 300 soldiers who had saluted her first weeks ago. Not all could return, but dozens had, in clean boots and pressed uniforms, their eyes bright with respect. Aiden stood at the front, not in his blue uniform, but in a simple gray shirt with sleeves rolled up, and his old dog tags around his neck. His vows were short, but not shallow. I could give you a ring, he said gently, taking her hand, but you never needed proof. So instead, I give you this. He unclasped one of the tags from the chain. It was newly engraved. You saved a soldier's soul. Eliza held her breath. He gently placed it in her palm. I don't need the world to know what you did, he said, just for you to carry this and know someone lived because of you. Her hand shook. She kissed the tag before slipping it around her neck over her heart. After the ceremony, guests gathered around fold-out tables where bowls of soup were passed. Laughter rang like music, and every toast was made with hot tea. Eliza had never seen anything more beautiful. That night, she stepped out back of the center, where a new wooden sign hung just above the kitchen door. Aiden had carved it himself, each letter smoothed with care. This place doesn't just serve meals, it nourishes souls. She smiled. Behind her, she heard Aiden's footsteps. He wrapped his arms around her waist, rested his chin on her shoulder. We've built something, he whispered. Not just a kitchen. She nodded, leaning into him. A kind of home. Inside, light from the kitchen glowed soft and golden through the windows. Then the door creaked open. A boy stepped in, maybe 8 or 9, in an oversized, tattered hoodie, eyes wide, hands stuffed in his pockets. Eliza turned, her voice gentle. "Are you hungry?" He nodded. "How about some soup?" Another nod. She knelt beside him, smiling. "What about a bowl of hot chicken soup and a story about how kindness can go further than you think?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Do you have a story about a soldier?" Eliza reached for his hand. "I have a story about a soldier and the woman who served him a meal he never forgot." Aiden set another bowl on the table, and as they sat beside the boy, as the room filled once more with that quiet comfort of those who choose to care, Eliza knew the truth. She'd never be famous, never make magazine covers or national news again. But here, in this little kitchen with its chipped tiles and handmade signs, she had everything she needed. A purpose, a partner, a place where no one was invisible. And as the laughter echoed down the halls and the soup steamed in the cool night air, Eliza looked around and thought, you don't need medals to be remembered. In the quiet exchange between these two characters, we witness the rawness of emotional vulnerability and the power of simply staying. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always require grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with a gentle presence, a soft voice in the dark, and the courage to say, "I'm not okay." Through their fragile yet tender dialogue, we're reminded how much it means to be seen, to be heard, and, most importantly, to be allowed to feel without judgment. If this moment touched you, show your support for the character who's trying to hold it together while slowly falling apart. Let them know their pain is valid and their journey matters. What would you say to someone who feels they can't open up? What might help them take that first step toward trust? And if stories like these move you, stories that honor quiet resilience, honest emotion, and the quiet heroes among us, please consider subscribing to Touching Tales Hub. Your support helps keep these heartfelt narratives alive. Let's build a community where every soul feels less alone. Don't just watch, feel, reflect, and pass it on.